Colorado is facing a wildfire crisis unlike anything seen in decades, and the clock is ticking faster than anyone anticipated. In the past 6 months alone, wildfires have destroyed over 300,000 acres across the state, displacing thousands of families, damaging critical infrastructure, and overwhelming emergency response teams. Entire neighborhoods in Boulder County and Larimer County have been reduced to ashes in a matter of hours, leaving residents scrambling for shelter, often with nothing but what they could carry. Smoke blankets the skies over Denver, creating hazardous air conditions, forcing schools to cancel outdoor activities, and sending hospitals into emergency mode as asthma and respiratory cases spike. This is not a distant or abstract problem. It is happening in your state right now, in your communities, in your neighborhoods, and it is threatening lives, property, and public safety on an unprecedented scale. Mayor after mayor, emergency management officials, and Governor Polis himself are facing intense scrutiny as the state struggles to mobilize resources efficiently. Reports from local fire chiefs reveal that critical firefighting equipment is stretched to its limits, water reservoirs are being depleted faster than they can be replenished, and volunteer firefighters are being forced into rotational shifts that leave some areas virtually unprotected. Meanwhile, state emergency communication lines are experiencing breakdowns under the flood of distress calls, leaving residents stranded in high-risk zones without guidance or timely evacuation notices. Every minute that passes without decisive action increases the danger. And the reality is chilling. This is not merely an environmental crisis, it is a human and administrative disaster compounded by delayed response, unclear policy, and systemic oversight failures. The financial toll is equally staggering. Insured losses are projected to exceed $1.2 billion this year alone, while uninsured losses, particularly among low-income residents, are incalculable. Schools that were already underfunded now face damage to infrastructure, forcing closures or temporary relocation, leaving children without access to classrooms for weeks at a time. Hospitals are contending with both the health effects of wildfire smoke and logistical disruptions caused by road closures and power outages. Utility lines damaged by fires are causing blackouts, making it impossible for families to rely on basic services like heating, refrigeration, and communications. The economic ripple effect extends even further. Small businesses, many of which were already struggling post-pandemic, face destruction of property, loss of inventory, and the threat of permanent closure, contributing to long-term unemployment and destabilization of local economies. The emotional and psychological impact cannot be overstated. Families forced from their homes report high levels of stress, anxiety, and trauma, with children particularly vulnerable. First responders are working around the clock, often with inadequate support, risking their lives in extreme heat and hazardous conditions. Evacuation centers are overflowing and the state's mental health resources are stretched thin, leaving many residents without access to counseling or basic psychological care. Social services are being strained to the breaking point, and the scale of suffering is intensifying by the day. Despite the urgency, official responses have been criticized as slow and insufficient. Evacuation orders were delayed in some counties, funding allocations for firefighting efforts have been questioned, and long-term preventative measures, such as controlled burns and forest management programs, were underfunded for years. The state's leadership, including Governor Polis, is now under intense pressure to justify every decision, as residents demand accountability for what many see as preventable destruction. Emergency response teams are pushing forward heroically, but the questions remain: why wasn't the state better prepared? And why are families still paying the price for systemic inaction? The scale of the crisis is immense, but the real story lies beneath the immediate flames. What appears to be a natural disaster is intertwined with human and political failure, leaving communities exposed at a critical moment. This is not just a wildfire season, it is a reckoning for Colorado, its leadership, and its ability to protect its citizens. The next chapters will reveal how years of oversight, mismanagement, and ignored warnings have converged to create a catastrophe that could have been mitigated, and why the consequences of delay will continue to ripple through every corner of the state. The wildfire crisis tearing through Colorado did not emerge overnight. It is the result of a decade-long convergence of environmental neglect, political missteps, and systemic oversight failures that have left communities dangerously exposed. At the heart of this crisis lies a combination of climate-driven factors and human mismanagement. Colorado's average temperatures have risen steadily over the past 2 decades, with the last 5 years marking record-breaking heat and drought conditions that have dried forests, reduced soil moisture, and created tinderbox conditions across vast swaths of the state. Scientists have repeatedly warned that without aggressive preventative measures, Colorado's wildfires would increase in both frequency and intensity, but these warnings were consistently sidelined, deprioritized, or underfunded by state leadership. Governor Jared Polis and legislative authorities face intense scrutiny for their handling of long-standing forestry and wildfire preparedness programs. Audits conducted over the past 5 years repeatedly highlighted gaps in forest management, including the failure to conduct controlled burns, clear deadwood, and maintain fire breaks in high-risk zones. These audits also exposed budget misallocations while state funds were allocated for urban infrastructure projects. Wildfire mitigation programs received a fraction of the funding necessary to keep forests and rural communities safe. Political leverage and bureaucratic maneuvering meant that agencies responsible for wildfire prevention were often caught in internal standoffs, delaying crucial action at the exact moment proactive measures were most needed. On a federal and state level, Colorado had access to extensive climate modeling and predictive analytics indicating which regions were most vulnerable to wildfire outbreaks. Yet year after year, warnings from environmental scientists and fire authorities were downplayed in public statements or presented in a diluted form that failed to convey the immediacy of the threat. These warnings were not merely ignored, they were systematically deprioritized in favor of politically expedient narratives that framed the state as being prepared for wildfire season. Meanwhile, infrastructure in high-risk areas, including fire access roads, emergency water reservoirs, and communication systems for rapid evacuation, remained underdeveloped or poorly maintained. Beyond environmental and bureaucratic factors, human activity played a critical role. Rapid suburban expansion into forested areas, poorly regulated land use policies, and the absence of strict building codes for fire-resistant materials have left homes and communities particularly vulnerable. Developers and municipal planners often prioritized growth and economic incentives over safety, while regulatory oversight lagged far behind urban expansion. This combination of development and environmental neglect created a perfect storm: densely populated areas surrounded by forests and grasslands primed for ignition, all without sufficient mitigation measures. The interplay of leadership decisions, or lack thereof, is stark. Reports from former emergency officials indicate that budget delays for wildfire preparedness were often used as political bargaining chips in legislative negotiations, leaving crucial funding on hold as the wildfire season approached. Equipment purchases, personnel hiring, and training programs were all postponed or scaled back, while officials publicly assured residents that the state was ready for the worst. In reality, delays in allocating resources meant that when fires broke out, local authorities were forced into reactive, last-minute mobilizations rather than executing a carefully planned preventative strategy. What the public has yet to fully grasp is the scale of these hidden failures. Colorado's wildfire crisis is as much a story of human and political negligence as it is of environmental disaster. The fires themselves are visible, immediate, and terrifying, but the systemic mismanagement, underfunding, and ignored warnings that set the stage for destruction remain largely unseen. This chapter of inaction and oversight failure lays the foundation for the human and economic fallout that is now ravaging the state, and it explains why communities, families, and frontline responders are bearing the brunt of a disaster that could have been mitigated. The stage is set for chaos, and what happens next will reveal the full human cost of years of inaction and mismanagement. Colorado is burning, but the roots of this disaster stretch far deeper than the flames, into the halls of power, the allocation of resources, and the decisions that were delayed, ignored, or avoided altogether. The wildfires raging across Colorado are not abstract statistics or distant headlines, they are a daily reality, tearing through families, livelihoods, and entire communities. Thousands of residents have been forced to flee their homes, leaving behind decades of possessions, memories, and security. Emergency shelters are overflowing, and local authorities are struggling to provide even the most basic necessities. In towns like Park and Grand Lake, residents describe waking up to a landscape that looks like a war zone, with charred trees, blackened hillsides, and smoke. Sunlight is barely visible. For families, the trauma is immediate. Children waking to sirens, parents scrambling to evacuate pets and elderly relatives, and entire households uncertain whether they will ever return home. In one evacuation center, a single mother described clutching her 2 children as flames licked the outskirts of their neighborhood, unsure if her home still stood. These are not isolated incidents, they are happening simultaneously across multiple counties, with each new fire adding to the growing human toll. The economic repercussions are equally severe and far-reaching. Small businesses, often the backbone of Colorado's local economies, have been forced to close either temporarily or permanently. Restaurants, retail stores, and service providers watch as fire destroys not only property but customer trust and continuity. The state is already projecting hundreds of millions in economic losses, with insurance claims skyrocketing and federal disaster relief struggling to keep pace. Farmers and ranchers, whose livelihoods depend on access to grazing lands and irrigation, face devastating losses as fires consume pasturelands, destroy fences, and kill livestock. The ripple effect is staggering. Employees lose jobs, supply chains are disrupted, and local economies enter a period of instability that could last years. One rancher recounted losing over half of his herd to the flames, leaving him not only financially ruined but facing the psychological burden of seeing animals perish under circumstances he had no control over. Healthcare systems are also under immense pressure, compounding the human suffering. Hospitals and clinics in affected areas are grappling with an influx of respiratory and burn-related cases, while emergency responders are stretched beyond capacity. Smoke inhalation has led to spikes in asthma attacks and cardiac complications, particularly among the elderly and children. Nursing staff report working 16-hour shifts without relief, often transporting patients to facilities outside their communities due to evacuation or infrastructure damage. Mental health services are overwhelmed, as the psychological strain of displacement, trauma, and uncertainty weighs heavily on residents. Families are forced to cope not only with the loss of property but also with the deep emotional scars left by watching their communities go up in flames. Communities are fracturing under the combined weight of environmental catastrophe and human error. Evacuations have left neighborhoods eerily empty, while others are scrambling to create ad hoc firefighting brigades in the absence of sufficient state resources. Public confidence in local and state leadership is eroding rapidly, with residents openly questioning the decisions, or lack thereof, that allowed this crisis to escalate. Schools in affected regions are closed or operating under emergency schedules, leaving students behind academically and disrupting the lives of working parents. Public infrastructure, from roads to water systems, is either damaged or being diverted for emergency use, amplifying the daily struggles of ordinary residents. The long-term consequences are equally chilling. Even after the fires are contained, rebuilding will be slow, costly, and emotionally draining. Families who have lost everything face an uncertain future, businesses may never reopen, and rural economies may collapse entirely. The wildfire crisis exposes a stark reality. Years of inaction, underfunding, and ignored warnings have created conditions where both human life and economic stability are at constant risk. Colorado's residents are not only fighting fires, they are fighting the consequences of systemic neglect and policy failures that have left them dangerously exposed. This is the human and economic fallout in full force: families displaced, businesses shuttered, healthcare systems strained, and public confidence eroded. The state is burning, and the consequences are only beginning to surface, revealing the staggering cost of unpreparedness and mismanagement. As Colorado burns, the question on everyone's mind is simple but damning: who allowed this crisis to escalate to such devastating levels? The finger of responsibility points squarely at political leadership at multiple levels, from Governor Polis to local officials, whose repeated inaction and mismanagement have left communities dangerously exposed. Despite years of warnings from environmental scientists, firefighting authorities, and emergency management experts, critical prevention measures were delayed or ignored. Reports detailing the increasing risk of wildfires, fueled by climate change, decades of forest mismanagement, and outdated infrastructure, sat on desks for months, unaddressed and underfunded. Public budgets allocated for forest thinning, firebreak creation, and community preparedness programs were repeatedly reduced or reallocated to other initiatives, leaving first responders and residents ill-equipped when flames began to spread uncontrollably. The contrast between public messaging and actual preparedness is stark. While state leadership repeatedly reassured communities that they were ready for any wildfire season, the reality on the ground tells a much darker story. Governor Polis and state lawmakers face growing criticism for prioritizing optics over action. Press conferences highlighted emergency plans, but audits later revealed that key resources, such as specialized firefighting crews, water-dropping helicopters, and evacuation coordination centers, were either underfunded or deployed too late to make a meaningful impact. Local governments, constrained by limited funding and political gridlock, struggled to fill the gaps, leading to inconsistent responses across counties. In some areas, residents reported waiting hours for emergency assistance, while others received conflicting evacuation orders, creating confusion and chaos. Public outrage is intensifying as citizens realize that lives were put at risk not only by the natural force of the fires but by preventable human failures. Controversial decisions extend beyond funding. Policies regarding land management, building codes, and emergency zoning have long been criticized by experts for failing to account for the growing threat of wildfires. Despite multiple advisories warning that densely wooded areas with aging infrastructure were at extreme risk, new construction continued without adequate fire-resistant measures, and older communities remained vulnerable. Moreover, the coordination between state agencies, federal resources, and local fire departments often broke down under pressure, highlighting systemic flaws in crisis management. Documents obtained from recent legislative sessions reveal that critical conversations about wildfire mitigation were repeatedly postponed or deprioritized in favor of political negotiations, leaving communities caught in the crossfire of bureaucracy. The human cost of these decisions is amplified by the perception that those in power remain insulated from accountability. While residents lose homes, jobs, and even loved ones, political leaders continue to defend their track record with promises of future action rather than concrete immediate solutions. Public protests have erupted across the state, demanding transparency and accountability, yet the response has largely been limited to statements and press appearances rather than substantive policy shifts. Critics point out that the same leadership failures could exacerbate future wildfire seasons, creating a cycle of disaster that becomes increasingly difficult to break. Colorado's wildfire crisis is not just a natural disaster, it is a story of preventable catastrophe amplified by human error, bureaucratic paralysis, and political calculations. The contrast between what officials promised and what was delivered is not a matter of minor missteps. It is a systemic failure with real, tangible consequences. Communities devastated by flames are forced to confront the bitter reality that leadership decisions or indecisions played a pivotal role in the scale and intensity of the destruction. Every burned home, every displaced family, and every overwhelmed first responder reflects a chain of accountability that stretches from the state capitol to local offices, revealing the urgent need for transparency, reform, and genuine responsibility. This is a moment for reckoning. The controversy surrounding Colorado's wildfire preparedness lays bare a critical truth: natural disasters are inevitable, but disasters of this magnitude are not. Leadership choices, funding priorities, and policy decisions directly shape the scale of the devastation, and unless these failures are confronted, the cycle will repeat, leaving residents vulnerable year after year. The fires that have already ravaged Colorado are only the beginning. Climate projections, combined with decades of mismanagement, indicate that the state is heading toward an era of unprecedented disaster if decisive action is not taken immediately. Rising temperatures, prolonged droughts, and shifting weather patterns have made the environment far more combustible, turning each summer into a high-stakes gamble for every community situated near forested areas. Scientists warn that wildfire seasons will continue to lengthen, with more intense and frequent blazes threatening not only homes and businesses but also the very infrastructure that keeps communities functioning. Roads, power lines, and water systems that are already strained could fail entirely under the pressure of repeated disasters, leaving entire towns cut off, without essential services, and vulnerable to secondary crises such as disease outbreaks, water shortages, and mass evacuations. The human and economic cost of continued inaction is staggering. Thousands of families face the loss of homes, possessions, and livelihoods year after year, with insurance companies either hiking premiums to unsustainable levels or withdrawing coverage from high-risk areas entirely. Local economies, already fragile in many regions, will struggle to recover after repeated cycles of destruction, with small businesses closing permanently and employment opportunities evaporating. Schools in affected areas may be forced to shut down temporarily, or even permanently, disrupting the education of thousands of children and leaving parents with impossible choices about childcare and work. Hospitals and medical centers, stretched thin during fire emergencies, may not be able to maintain operations during the most critical moments, risking lives and eroding public trust in essential institutions. Perhaps the most alarming consequence of prolonged inaction is the widening inequality that will inevitably follow. Wealthier residents may have the resources to evacuate, rebuild, or relocate, while low- and middle-income families will bear the brunt of the devastation, trapped in increasingly hazardous zones with minimal support. Rural communities, already underserved in terms of emergency services, will face compounded vulnerabilities, leaving them disproportionately exposed to disaster. The social fabric of Colorado could fray under the stress of repeated emergencies as displacement, economic strain, and trauma accumulate, creating long-term consequences that reach far beyond the immediate fire season. Leadership decisions over the coming months and years will determine whether Colorado succumbs to these projections or fights back against an accelerating crisis. The failures of the past are a stark warning. Budgets must be allocated efficiently, infrastructure must be modernized, and communities must be equipped with the tools and knowledge to respond effectively. Forest management practices need to shift from reactive to preventive, with investments in fire breaks, controlled burns, and early detection systems. Emergency response coordination between state agencies, local governments, and federal resources must be seamless, ensuring that aid reaches residents before devastation spreads. Without these changes, the state risks repeating a cycle of disaster that grows in scale and severity with each passing year. The question looming over Colorado, and indeed over every state facing similar threats, is not whether wildfires will occur but how much worse they will become before anyone acts. Residents, officials, and leaders must recognize that the cost of continued hesitation is measured not just in dollars, but in homes lost, lives disrupted, and communities forever altered. Colorado's future is at a crossroads. Action now could prevent catastrophe, while indecision guarantees that flames will continue to dictate the fate of its people. The stakes could not be higher, and the warning could not be clearer. The state stands on the precipice of a disaster that is preventable, yet rapidly approaching. Every choice, every delay, every ignored warning will shape the next wildfire season. The question isn't whether Colorado will face devastation. It's how far it will be allowed to go before leaders and citizens finally confront the reality of a crisis that has been decades in the making.